In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light, and God saw the light, that it was good. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and the evening and the morning were the first day. Hello, everyone. This is The Secret of Eternal Product Life. I'm Ernest Adams, and you've just heard the creation myth of the Israelites. I want to start off with my usual disclaimers that I always have to give at these things. What I'm about to say is not the opinion of my employers. My lectures tend to take the form of sermons, and a sermon is a highly personal view. Also, for those of you who haven't been to church much lately, the preacher does not take questions during the sermon. I'll be happy to talk to people afterwards. The subtitle of this talk is Lessons from J.R.R. Tolkien and John Madden, two men than whom it is difficult to imagine more different. The first part is the Madden part of the talk. And basically, to give you the background here, this is a lesson on product longevity. Now, it's not going to be as boring as that sounds, I hope. Those of you who are familiar with my lectures in the past know that I like to speculate about all kinds of weird stuff. And the so-called topic of the lecture is really just a hook to hang other ideas on. I'm not going to be talking about the shelf life of individual SKUs, by the way. I'm talking about the life of entire product lines. John Madden Football, or as it's known now, Madden NFL Football, is the best-selling sports video game of all time. And it's been around since 1988 in one form or another. It originally came out on the Apple II, and then it moved to the IBM PC, and then to the Sega Genesis, and then more recently to the Sony PlayStation, the Sega Saturn, and the PC again. It is an unusually long-lived product. There are comparatively few products, maybe Ultima, Wizardry, and so on, that have lasted that long, not counting the ones that are online, which, of course, are continuously updated. I've been working on John Madden Football since 1993, so I've seen a little bit less, I guess, than half of its product life. And I wanted to start off by talking about some of the things that I believe, have helped to make Madden a success. To start with, of course, sports games have some unfair advantages. How many other industries can you name that have an entire section of the newspaper devoted to them all across the country every day? You know, there might be a few pages on the aerospace industry in Seattle, but the sports industry has an entire section every single day all across the country. So there's an enormous amount of interest in sports already. And the sports industry, or particular sports, consists of periodic events. That is, a sports season lasts for a certain amount of time each year with a great deal of changing data. So you've always got something to sell people. And that also gives sports games an unfair advantage. Basically, the flight characteristics of an F-16 do not change all that much from year to year. If they do, the general public doesn't know about it. But the roster of the San Francisco 49ers does change from year to year, and if you don't have it right, you will find out about it. However, be that as it may, I think there are particular reasons, for Madden's success. And the first reason, the one right at the top, is the ever-elusive fun factor. Madden has not always had the greatest graphics and the greatest sound, and I think we would freely admit that. But it does have an excellent license. It's an easily identifiable individual. And unlike having a license from a star player, John Madden is much less likely to get injured or to retire suddenly or something like that. And that obviously helps in product longevity. If you tie yourself to a given player, then you're tying yourself to that player's career. The other thing about Madden, with respect to the fun factor, is that it is easy to learn and easy to play. It uses context-sensitive behaviors rather than having a million buttons. Basically, we don't feel that the audience for fighting games who are capable of handling complex button sequences that make very specific oddball moves, overlaps that much with the audience for football games. And so we try, instead of having a million buttons, to just have a button that does the right thing at the right time. If you need to hurdle, it will hurdle. If you need to spin, it will spin. If you need to jump, it will jump, and so on. And this simplicity encourages rather than discourages new players. Now, one of the consequences of this is that it's fairly easy to learn, and that with some practice, becomes fairly easy to beat the AI. And that's kind of the downside of having a game that's easy to learn and easy to get into. But Madden has always really been thought of as a multiplayer game anyway. I mean, you know, it's sold rather like a single-player game, like all the other cartridges on the shelves, but the vast majority of the aficionados play it as a multiplayer game, and that's where the real fun comes in. And we think that it's worth having the downside of the fact that you can beat it 89-0 after you've been playing it 6 months, to get the upside of having large numbers of people be able to play it. Now, there are counterexamples to this out in the industry, of course. You know, IndyCar racing, for example, is the racing fiend's game, and it also is a great success. So nothing of what I'm going to say is an absolute hard and fast rule. Another reason that I think Madden has been a success has to do with a programmer disease that I'm sure that a number of you are familiar with, called creeping featureism. You know the phenomenon where a programmer is never finished because the programmer can always add one more feature and then one more feature and then one more feature. And a lot of products kind of get this. With Madden, we have sort of deliberately made creeping featureism a plus. We've turned it into a benefit. In 1992, we had neither an NFL nor an NFL Players Association contract, so we had neither genuine team names nor player names. In 93, we had an NFL contract, so we got the team names but not the player names. In 94, we added the Players Association, so we had both the players and the teams. In 95, we started adding old-time teams, so you could play with the 84 49ers or the 52 Lions. In 1996, we added the ability to trade players among teams. And then in 1997, we moved to the PSX. And so we slowed down the pace of putting in new features to concentrate on handling the new technology. So creeping featureism, giving them a little something new every year, has obviously helped Madden a great deal. The third reason for Madden's success in my mind, and this is, I think, the most important one, is that it has always placed content before technology. There are technology-driven games out there, and in my mind, a technology-driven game is a game which is intended to exploit a given technology. For example, Doom came out, and Doom's real purpose was to exploit and demonstrate raycasting, and it did that extraordinarily well. But that's really kind of what it's all about. Another example that comes to mind is Star Fox, which came out specifically to show off Nintendo's FX chip. The problem with doing that is that your technology will be copied in 3 months, and 3 months after that, it will be old news. Doom comes out and everyone is amazed. Hexen and other things like it come out and everybody says, oh yeah, that's a Doom clone, big deal. So new technology with poor content won't get you good reviews. Critical Path, for example, was the first game to have a lot of motion video in it, but it was a poor game. Old technology with good content can get you good reviews. Maxis turned out good tile-based games year after year after year, and Civilization certainly was not using a lot of breakthrough technology. And badly implemented new technology is absolutely the kiss of death. Electronic Arts had a wonderful baseball simulator called Earl Weaver Baseball 1.5 for the Amiga, which generated better baseball simulation statistics than anything else on the market at the time. And so they put out another version called Earl Weaver 2, and they put a very badly implemented 3D front end on it. And it died a terrible death in the marketplace, despite the fact that it still had a wonderful baseball sim underneath. The badly implemented 3D front end just killed it. So Madden is content-driven. It was originally on the Apple II and the generic PC right at the end of those machines' product life cycles, and its technology changed relatively slowly during the Genesis years. What changed from year to year was the content. And when the PSX came along, obviously we took steps to support it, and we beefed it up quite a bit, but we did not make the mistake that we had made with Earl Weaver and try to overdo it. We wanted to get on the PSX, bring it out, have a good-looking product there without trying to overstep our abilities, because we felt that it was important to be solid on that machine before trying to add truly amazing whiz-bangs. That's for this year, of course. So, new technology does not make a game that lasts, because technology does not last itself. And that's one of the conclusions from Madden. If you are specifically trying to make a long-lived game, then I would suggest that what you do is burn developer cycles rather than adding too many features at a time. Use those cycles to tune the game, make the game play better, rather than burning those cycles to put in new features. After all, every new feature is 2 new bugs, right? Also, emphasize content and features over technology. You should incorporate technology changes in your later releases, of course. You have to in order to keep up. But don't make that the raison d'etre of the whole product, not if your point is to create a long-lived game. And don't go after new technology until you are ready to use it and until you need to use it. Going after new technology with a development team that isn't really qualified to do it is a mistake. And we haven't made that mistake with Madden. Software is not the reason for playing the game. The game is the reason for playing the game. So that's kind of the Madden portion of the talk. That will make my employers happy. And that's the kind of straightforward and direct thing about product longevity that I wanted to tell you about, the lessons from John Madden. In the beginning, the world was inhabited only by animals, and there were no humans. And the tiger and the bear prayed together to God for wisdom and for betterment of their status. And they prayed together for many days. But in time, the tiger became hungry, and he abandoned his prayers to hunt. But the bear continued to pray, and God heard her prayers, and he sent his son down to earth to speak with her. And the Son of God said, "For your steadfastness you will be rewarded. Take these herbs and eat, and go into this cave and sleep, and you will receive your reward." And the bear ate the herbs, and she went into the cave and slept, but not for a night. She slept the whole winter through. And when she emerged in the spring, the Son of God was there, and she was no longer a bear, but the first human woman. And she did cohabit with the Son of God, and their children became the human race, the Koreans. So the second part of this talk is kind of the more speculative part, the kind of Tolkien part of the talk. And I began thinking about these issues of product longevity because one of the things I feel about most computer games is that they are just about 1 inch deep. They don't really feel like they're part of anything larger. When you get to the end of a computer game, you don't feel like there's a great deal more to go on to. You feel like you've pretty much seen all that there is to see. And so our work doesn't last. And obviously, one reason why our work doesn't last is the inexorable march of technology and the fact that we're constantly having to upgrade that. But I think, as we've shown with Madden, that you can deal with that you can create a product line which lasts despite advances in technology. That's not necessarily a good excuse for having a product line that doesn't last. I think the real reason that our product lines don't last is that we have a lot of short-term thinking. We don't really sit down and plan to create product lines that last. I don't know whether it's not something that interests us or we don't have time for it or what it is, but most of the time we're only kind of looking till next Christmas, and I think that's too bad. And I began to think about, well, what would be the important aspects of long-term successes? What kinds of conditions might be important to have? And in my sole concession to audiovisual aids, I will put up my list. I'm sure there's a switch here somewhere. Oh, big one on top. So here's my list. Compelling activity or premise. Obviously, you want to have an activity or some kind of an idea that you want your player to enjoy that will compel them to come back and want to do it again. Clearly, you need to have excellent content, good graphics, good sound, good acting, and so on. You need to have solid bug-free code. You obviously don't want to frustrate your player by having their game crash all the time. An intuitive user interface that doesn't confuse them, one that makes them interested and makes it easy to understand and come back to. Lots and lots of well-placed marketing, obviously. And a great license or tie-in is not an absolute necessity, but it's an important thing to have some of the time. It's certainly a useful thing to have if you can afford it. Now, that's it. You know what I have to say about that list? Boring. Who cares? So what? If you've been in this industry more than 6 months, you've already got that list engraved on your soul. Nobody needs to tell you that. You certainly don't need to have to pay $650 at a minimum to come here and hear that list. No, I want to talk about a lot more subtle issues. I want to talk about the things that we need to do after you've done the stuff on that list. You know you've got to do the stuff on that list. I want to talk about the sort of second tier, the meta things that we need to think about when we're trying to create product development. And none of these issues that I'm going to bring up are either necessary or sufficient conditions for long-term success. What I'm going to describe here is not a set of laws or rules, just follow them and all of a sudden you will have a long-term success. That's not the way this kind of stuff works. These are lessons, not laws, and lessons are never absolute. But I do believe that they lead in the right direction. And I want to start, hold on a minute, by talking about Batman. Now, if your experience of Batman chiefly comes from the 1960s era television show, then I most earnestly beg you to forget it. Likewise, for that matter, the recent movies, I don't think the movies either capture the true spirit of Batman. No, I'm talking about the Batman of the DC Comics. Batman, to me, is much more interesting than all the other superheroes, for a couple of reasons. First off, Batman is not, in fact, a superhero. He didn't come from any exploding planets like Superman did. He didn't inhale any weird gases like the Flash. He wasn't bitten by any radioactive spiders. He didn't find a talking lantern like the Green Lantern. Batman is a normal man, and he has to solve his problems within a normal man's limitations. Now, admittedly, he is a very rich and very smart and very strong, and let's face it, very lucky man. But he is still basically just a man, and that, I think, makes him more interesting. And the second reason is that his motivations I find more interesting. Most other superheroes are motivated by a kind of a naive do-gooderism. Gee, I am endowed with superpowers. What shall I do? I shall fight crime. You know. Batman's motivations are somewhat different. He's not endowed with the superpowers. But when Bruce Wayne was a boy, he was walking home with his parents from the movies one night, and a man stepped out of an alley and shot his parents to death right in front of him and ran off. The memory of this event haunts Bruce Wayne. He has nightmares. He can't sleep. And so what he does instead is he gets on an outrageous costume and prowls around at night looking for other crimes to interfere with. Batman swore by the spirit of his parents to make war on all criminals shortly after their deaths. Now that's interesting. He did not swear to fight crime. He did not swear to do good. He did not swear to seek justice. He swore to make war, which is a much more morally ambiguous vow. So Batman is motivated by an inner rage, an inner hatred. And we saw that in some of his early stories. And then in the 1950s, along came the Comics Code Authority, and the tales of Batman were sanitized for several decades, and his inner rage was suppressed, and he became just another kind of naive do-gooder superhero. But in 1986, DC Comics took a very bold step, and they brought out a book called The Dark Knight Returns. And in this book, they chose to examine the question of what Batman's true nature really was and what it would really be like to have him in your town. And there's a scene in here that neatly summarizes Batman's character, I think. Batman is crouching in the shadows at the foot of some stairs behind his cape, and a thug with a gun is coming down the stairs behind him. And we hear Batman's thoughts in voiceover narration in an almost chillingly detached tone. He says to us, "There are 7 working defenses from this position. 3 of them disarm with minimal contact. 3 of them kill. 1 hurts." And he whirls around and kicks the thug violently in the stomach. Now observe here. Batman had 3 opportunities to kill, and he did not take any of them. He had 3 opportunities to disarm with minimal contact, and he did not take any of them. He had 1 opportunity to inflict pain, and that's the one he chose. That is the essence of Batman's real character. I don't think Batman does this stuff because he wants to. I think Batman does this stuff because he has to, because he is driven, he is compelled, he is obsessed. And I think in some respects, Batman has certain things in common with serial killers. Batman's violence is cathartic, it's orgasmic, it's almost masturbatory, it's what he does to help him get to sleep at night. In short, it's not about fighting crime, it's about beating the hell out of people. Bruce Wayne makes this morally palatable to himself by selecting victims that he's pretty sure deserve it. So in this book, the fundamental question is raised. Is Batman a heroic, public-spirited citizen, or is he an out-of-control vigilante? I mean, let's face it, the guy runs around beating up people that he thinks have done something wrong. He doesn't answer to anyone. He is judge, jury, and executioner. He is not bound by any constitutional restrictions about things like privacy or probable cause. And he has the winking cooperation of the police department. Gee, can't get a search warrant or a wiretap? That's okay. We'll ask Batman to do it for us. I think the reason he wears that mask is because he doesn't want to get sued. Is this really somebody we want running around our town? That's quite an interesting question. There's another scene in here that I think is really intriguing, too. It's a scene where Commissioner Gordon, say it isn't so, is about to retire, and he's talking to the captain who's going to be his replacement. And the captain who's going to be his replacement has sworn to put out an arrest warrant for Batman as soon as she takes office. And she says to Commissioner Gordon, "I don't see how you can support a vigilante." And Gordon says, "I'm sure you've heard old fossils like me talk about Pearl Harbor. Fact is, we mostly lie about it. We make it sound like we jumped up and went after the Axis on the spot. Hell, we were scared. Rumors were flying. We thought the Japanese had taken California. We didn't even have an army, so we were there lying in bed, pulling the sheets up over our heads. And there was Roosevelt on the radio, strong and sure, taking fear and turning it into a fighting spirit, and we got our army." A few years back, I heard a news magazine with a lot of people and a lot of evidence that said that Roosevelt knew Pearl was going to be attacked and that he let it happen. It wasn't proven. Things like that never are. I couldn't stop thinking about how horrible that would be and how Pearl was what got us off our duffs in time to stop the Axis. A lot of innocent men died, but we won the war. It bounced back and forth in my head until I realized I couldn't judge it. It was too big. He was too big. Since then, presidents have come and gone, each one seeming smaller, weaker, the best of them like faint echoes of Roosevelt. And Captain Yandel says, "Well, I don't see what this has to do with the vigilante." And Commissioner Gordon says, "Well, maybe you will." I was rather curious. I was very intrigued by that interchange. And I began to wonder. I'm a guy with a philosophy major, so I do these sorts of things in my spare time. Are some people's souls simply too big? Or are their jobs or their situations too complex to render moral judgments about? I don't think so. I think that way leads tyranny. If we allowed for that, then every tin-pot dictator who came along would be claiming that the end justified the means and that his soul was too big to be judged. No. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that we are all complex beings. It's not that there are some people, like Batman and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, about whom it is difficult to render moral judgments, or that their situations make them immune from moral judgments. The reality is that it is difficult to render moral judgments, period. And the more that is at stake, the harder it is. We are all as complex as Bruce Wayne. Not as troubled, maybe, not as driven, but as complex. Nobody is a saint. Even Mother Teresa, whom the media is fond of portraying as this little old lady who washes the feet of lepers and that kind of stuff, cannot possibly be a saint, because Mother Teresa, in reality, is a very, very effective administrator. And you don't get to be an effective administrator without being a hard ass some of the time. And it is that truth about us all that makes for great literature and great movies and great works which stand the test of time. Batman is interesting because he is morally ambiguous and because there is a mythic quality to his background. Wolverine is interesting because persons unknown gave him an adamantium skeleton against his will in a process that caused him great pain. I also find him interesting because he's only 5'3", and so I, really have a lot of respect for that. Superman is boring because he showed up on Earth one day and simply did what his parents told him to. Captain America is boring because he drank a weird potion and ta-da, he's Captain America. So what? Computer games and comic books present a morally simple world. And mainstream comic books present a trivial and artificial morality with no subtlety or depth. And The Dark Knight was one of the first mainstream comic books to break that tradition. They decided they were not going to submit it to the Comics Code Authority. And computer games present the same morally simple world. For example, in SimCity, if you tear down an old residential neighborhood that's not producing very much in the way of tax base, and you rezone it commercial, you don't have people demonstrating outside your office and saying that you're in the back pocket of big business. It just doesn't happen. You don't have to worry about it. So it's this game context, this, what they, Doonesbury called years ago, the thrill of victory / agony of defeat dichotomy, that defines what is morally good. Basically, what appropriate behavior is the thing that gets you more points. That which leads to more points is the right thing to do. And I think that we need to rid ourselves of these simplistic moralities and create challenges for our players in which judgments are not easy. Comics Code Authority comics do not continue to sell year after year after year, the same one over and over. This book came out in 1986, and it is still in print. It does continue to sell year after year after year. And I think the depth and the nature of its story and the recognition that Batman is not nearly as straightforward as the Comics Code Authority would like us to believe is the reason that this product has lasted. I think we want to re-examine the game metaphor and ask ourselves if giving points is really what we want to do. Or perhaps we could give different kinds of points for different things. You remember the board game Careers? In Careers, you could set up at the beginning of the game how much of different things you wanted to collect over the course of the game, love, money, or fame. And what you did is you played the game and you tried to reach your own goals, the goals that you had set up for yourself. Why don't we create more games like that? Another game that I think there's opportunity for more complex judgments in is Magic Carpet. Now, Magic Carpet seems like a great shooter, and you just run around and blow the hell out of everything. And it's one of the it's got a nice gimmick because, unlike most games until recently, when you hit something, it looks damaged in Magic Carpet. So if you shoot a fireball into the ground, you get a burn patch, and if you shoot a meteor storm into the ground, you get a very large burn patch, and so on. and the object of the game is to collect mana, which resides in living things. So you run around and you collect up all the mana, and when you win the game, you get to the end, and this sepulchral voice comes out and says, "Congratulations, Master Wizard, the world is restored to equilibrium." Yeah, it's a burned mess, and you've slaughtered every living thing on it, but it's in equilibrium. You know, I think it would have been nice if Magic Carpet had had a socially responsible mode. Now, I'm not saying that Magic Carpet should have been socially responsible, but I'd love to have been able to flip a switch that said, you know what, you get points deducted for causing a forest fire. The manual tells you that you can cause forest fires, and that will help you kill off the evil creatures, which is nice, but then you've got a burned forest at the end of it. So, you know, that's an example of the kind of thing where it would have been fun to have a mode in which you had a more complicated decision to make. Gee, you know, maybe I should restrict myself to lower energy weapons so I don't do quite so much environmental damage. Moral ambiguity, mythic themes, tough decisions. These are the sources of great, lasting legends. In the beginning, the universe was filled with undifferentiated matter, and all was chaos, which is chaos. But in time, the matter formed patterns and became ordered, which is cosmos. And of cosmos was made Gaia, the Earth Mother. And Gaia labored, and she brought forth Uranos, first of the Titans. And Gaia mated with Uranos and gave birth to the rest of the Titans and to Cronus, last of all. But Uranos was despotic, and Gaia encouraged the Titans to overthrow their father. And at last Cronus unmanned his father and cast his genitals into the sea, and Cronus took his place on the throne of the world. Now Cronus married Rhea, and their children were the gods. But Cronus feared that his children would do to him what he had done to his father. And so when each of his children were born, he ate them. And finally Rhea tricked Cronus, and when he was ready to eat Zeus, she gave him a stone to eat instead. And Zeus grew up and overthrew Cronus and forced him to disgorge his brothers and sister gods whom he had eaten. And he and his brother and sister gods defeated the Titans, the elder gods, and they became the younger gods and established the realm of the Olympians. But when Cronus threw the genitals of his father Uranos into the sea, they impregnated Gaia, the Earth Mother, and she brought forth all the living things upon the earth and in the sea and in the air. The Greeks. So, on to J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, to start with, I'm going to admit that I am a Tolkien fan. And I realize that this is tantamount to admitting that one attends Star Trek conventions or plays Dungeons and Dragons or something like that, neither of which I do. So I'll also say that I have my eyes open about Tolkien. I realize that Tolkien is not great literature. The guy is not in the same league as D.H. Lawrence and Virginia Woolf and Jorge Luis Borges. It's just not that good writing. And Tolkien's characters are fairly two-dimensional, and his themes are not particularly morally complex. Ooh, good versus evil, there's a new idea. Now, you may ask, how can Tolkien be successful without the moral complexity that I was just arguing for a minute ago? And one of the things you will notice about this lecture is that practically everything I say is going to be contradicted a minute later by something else that I say. To which I would respond, actually, moral complexity, as I pointed out earlier, is not a necessary or a sufficient condition. Tolkien has been successful without it. Nevertheless, I still think it is a valuable thing to bring to an entertainment product. I do believe that it's important, and in this genre in particular, I think moral complexity is too long neglected. But I've already made that argument, and I'm going on to Tolkien now. So, while I'm a fan, I do acknowledge the limitations of his work. Nevertheless, the average fantasy novel lasts on the shelves a few weeks or a few months or however long it is, not very long, and Tolkien continues to sell and sell and sell and sell. And why? What is it? Well, I think there are some things that Tolkien did right, and I think there are things that we can learn from. First thing I want to talk about is how Tolkien handled sequels. If you read Tolkien's works in the order in which they were published, The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, the Silmarillion, you notice something rather interesting. The Hobbit is a completely self-contained work. All the plot lines are tied up at the end, all the major characters are dealt with. When it's done, it's done. But it does contain some intriguing references. There's a brief mention that the Elven King was descended from those long ago elves who never went to the land of Faerie in the west. And at one point, the wizard Gandalf leaves the expedition to go help the White Council, whoever they are, drive the necromancer, whoever he is, out of his fortress in the fastness of Dol Guldur, wherever that is. We find out later that he was successful, but we don't find out very much more about it. So, The Hobbit contains references to a more ancient past and to a wider world than are included within the story itself. But it does not need them. The absence of further explanation does not detract from the story. If you go on to The Lord of the Rings, you find out a bit more about the elves and those who went to the land of Faerie in the west. You find out exactly who the necromancer is and what's going on with him. But it contains still more intriguing references. There's a mention of the last alliance of elves and men, the drowning of Numenor, some people called the Valar, and it's never very clear what that's about either. And again, at the end of The Lord of the Rings, the story is completely tied up, everyone is dealt with, you don't have to know this stuff. But it piques your curiosity. Finally, you read the Silmarillion and it answers them all, because the Silmarillion is the complete cosmology, theology, history, geography, and ancient literature of Tolkien's universe. So it brings this stuff to a close and answers all those questions. Another good example of this kind of thing is in Ursula K. Le Guin's Earthsea trilogy, where each work is completely self-contained, tied up at the end, but contains references to a wider world and a more ancient time. By comparison, let's look at how the sequel to Star Wars was handled. When we saw Darth Vader regain control of his careening TIE bomber and go zooming off into the galaxy at the end, Lucas might just as well have put up big red letters that said, sequel coming, sequel coming. You know, that part of the story wasn't wrapped up. We didn't know Darth Vader's fate. He was a major character, clearly, and he just somehow got away and we didn't find out what happened to him. Now, that's not a problem with Star Wars. Star Wars was obviously very successful because it was plenty compelling and we wanted to come back and find out about it anyway. But with less compelling material, it will eventually start to anger your audience. Two examples of this are the Riverworld series by Philip Jose Farmer, which just seemed to go on and on and on, and you wondered if he was ever going to explain what the hell was going on. And another example was Twin Peaks. And I began to wonder if David Lynch was laughing at us, you know. Got them suckered, I can get them watching surrealist nonsense for years. Now, it's not that big a deal with television, where all you have to do is tune in once a week and it's free, more or less. It's not that big a deal with books and movies, where you have to go down to the bookstore or the movie theater and plunk down another $5.95. It's a little bit different with computer games, where you have to go down to the computer store and plunk down $59.50. 10 times as much. When I get the end of a computer game, I expect it to be the end. I do not expect to get to the end and find out that I'm going to have to go plunk down another $60 for the next game in a series that's going to last God knows how long. So the first lesson from Tolkien is, make them want to come back, rather than make them have to come back. You cannot create product longevity simply by stringing your audience along. And Tolkien did not do that. The next interesting thing about Tolkien is that while his books were published in the order The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, The Silmarillion, not counting some smaller works of poetry in between, the Silmarillion was actually written first. And as I said, it's the complete cosmology, theology, geography, and history of his universe. And Tolkien took it to the publishers and they said, gee, the legends of a non-existent place containing no sex, almost no dialogue, written in a quasi-biblical language. Oh yeah, this is just going to fly off the shelves. So, it was published last. But, because it was written first, Tolkien's work is incredibly self-consistent. Between The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, and all his other stuff, it really feels very much like it's part of a whole that Tolkien had completely envisioned from start to finish. The world feels complete. As an example of a world that to me does not feel complete, and again this is an example of something which has been a success, but I think it's been a success in spite of this rather than because of it, that's the world of Star Trek. I don't have a very clear picture of what's going on in the world of Star Trek. I don't understand its politics. I don't understand how the Federation works or who's really in charge at Starfleet Command or whether they actually have any money or don't have any money. And, you know, there's been a lot of work afterwards trying to go back and make it consistent. And another example of people who do that absolutely all the time, to the point of excess, in my opinion, is Sherlock Holmes. The Sherlock Holmes stories were dashed off very, very quickly. Conan Doyle was not particularly interested in creating a complete and unified world, and they're horribly inconsistent. It's not clear whether Dr. Watson received his injury in his shoulder or his leg. And a lot of people spend a lot of time trying to make up explanations for why they're so inconsistent. But I know how the Star Trek world problem came about, because the series was being developed under pressure. They were creating a television series. They had to crank out the things week after week after week. But let's face it, there's a problem. I mean, an example that has become a standing joke is Kirk and the Prime Directive. Kirk's always breaking the Prime Directive. You know, sometimes on flimsy excuses, sometimes on no excuse at all. Now, I approve of Roddenberry's instinct here. I mean, America was in the middle of the Vietnam War, and he wanted to make a comment about imperialism at a time when you absolutely did not talk about such things on primetime television, and I think it was gutsy of him to do so. But they wrote in the Prime Directive without really having thought through what the implications were going to be for the rest of the series. And so, you know, as a result, we have this. The Prime Directive does not really feel like one of the great moral imperatives of the Federation, despite the fact that they always claim it is. Babylon 5, on the other hand, is a world that does, to me at least, feel complete. You just get the sense that Straczynski has thought it all out. Now, he's told us he's thought it all out, but it feels as if he probably has. And I think, in time, people will come to think that Babylon 5 is a better series than Star Trek. God help me if you start getting into an argument about that here and now, but that's my opinion in any case, and since I have the microphone. So the second lesson from Tolkien is, if you are planning and intending deliberately to create a product with a long lifespan, then I strongly urge you to create your world ahead of time, as Tolkien did. Now, sometimes you don't have that option, as with Star Trek. Another example of a place where that happened is with the Electronic Arts Strike series. Desert Strike was a big success, and so they went on to create Jungle Strike, and it was a big success, and so they went on to create Urban Strike, and it was a big success, and so they went on to create Soviet Strike. And, you know, they've been scrambling to build this world just as quickly as they could as they went on. But sometimes you can sort of get caught by your success and not have time to do it. But if you're planning from the beginning to create a world that you want to last, then try to do it ahead of time. At least try to do it before you bring out the first sequel to the first product. Now, for the third lesson, I want to talk a little bit about my experience of reading Tolkien's works. When I got to the end of the Silmarillion, I thought, okay, that's all there is. You know, I've read the geography and the history. But then I was sort of intrigued by Wagner's ring cycle. It also seemed to be about dwarves and dragons and magic rings that rule the world. And I found out that Wagner was loosely based on Old Norse and Germanic and Icelandic legends, and I started to get interested in them, and I got interested in Beowulf and Anglo-Saxon poetry and that kind of stuff. And all of a sudden I came across this word, orc. Now, I was absolutely sure that Tolkien, like all other fantasy writers, had just made this word up. You know, that it was just this kind of nonsense word that he'd conjured out of the air and put down on paper. And I shouldn't say all other fantasy writers, but that does seem to be common, that a lot of fantasy just seems to be full of sort of gibberish that people have made up. And Tolkien hadn't. Orc is, in fact, the old Anglo-Saxon word for demon. And the name Bjorn, which was a character in a Tolkien work who was a man who could turn himself into a bear at night, that is, in fact, the Anglo-Saxon word for bear, and so on. There's quite a lot of these. And the names of all the dwarves are taken right out of the Icelandic sagas. And I began to realize, bear in mind that I was young, that Tolkien's work is based on an enormous body of earlier work. And all this stuff that I thought he just made up out of his own head, all those names and all the rest of that stuff, were in fact only borrowed. Tolkien's works are not works of pure imagination. And I talked about this a little bit last year, but I want to go into it some more this year. Now, as creative people, we prefer, I think, to create works of pure imagination. We want to express our own creativity and ideas. Imagine that you're an art student. Which would you rather do? You know, they plunk down a vase in front of you with some irises in it, and they say, I want you to paint this in the style of Van Gogh. I want you to paint it so that it looks like Van Gogh painted it. Would you rather do that, or would you rather paint it in your own style? Would you rather compose music in your style, or would you rather be told that you have to compose it in Mozart's style? Would you rather create computer games in your style, or would you rather create computer games in Chris Crawford's style? I mean, you know, we don't really like being told that we have to do things in someone else's style. And I think works of pure imagination to us somehow seem sort of more honest, more personal. If a friend comes to us with a painting and they say, look, I painted this painting, that's one thing. If they say, look, I made a copy of Van Gogh's painting, that's another thing. You know, it feels more honest somehow. We give more credit and more attention to work that is entirely someone's own than work which is a copy or in someone else's style. And what was one of the slogans of the 60s? Do your own thing, right? About one of the nastiest things you can say about a creative work is that it's derivative. But as I began to think about this and think about Tolkien and what he had done, I began to wonder if that attitude is really appropriate. The thing about pure imagination is that it's fairly easy to do rapidly, but it's not easy to do well. Works of pure imagination do not require any study of existing work. They do not require any knowledge of culture history. When you're creating a work of pure imagination, you don't have to know anything. It just all comes out of your own head. And I think this is why much of modern art, like abstract expressionism, leaves people cold, because it has no cultural roots. It doesn't have any frame of reference. It doesn't reach out and touch the viewer's soul. Most works of pure imagination that are done rapidly are about 1 inch deep, and that applies to computer games, which are made in 1 or 2 years. We simply don't have the time to devote to works of pure imagination than they require. By contrast, Tolkien's works, which are not works of pure imagination, still took most of a lifetime to create to the level of depth that it has. In an analogy to building, a work of pure imagination is like a column standing by itself. It's held up only by its own inner strength. It has no other support, and it's fairly easy to knock down. A work of derived imagination is a bit like the block at the top of a pyramid. Tolkien's works are like the block at the top of a giant pyramid. The top is what everyone wants to see. The top is where everyone wants to go. You get there, and the first thing you do is climb up to the top and look around. But after you've looked at it, you begin to realize that it rests on an enormous foundation. And you start to ask yourself if maybe there isn't something inside. Too many computer games, I think, are works of pure imagination. They're all done in 1 or 2 years. They're all 1 or 2 inches deep. They don't reach in and touch anyone's soul. As Isaac Newton said, if I have seen farther, it was by standing on the shoulders of giants. The third lesson from Tolkien is borrow, steal, rip off, plagiarize, whatever. We need to stop trying to make it all up ourselves. We need to learn to draw on other resources. We need to acknowledge that we are not giants. Go out there and look for other stuff, and you will have a longer-lived product. In the beginning, there was nothing but endless space, and Tawa, the sun spirit. And Tawa took of his own essence, and he made the first world. But the people of the first world were all insects, who lived in caves and fought among themselves, and Tawa was displeased, and he sent the spider grandmother to them, who led them up to the second world. And when they arrived at the second world, the people were transformed into wolves and dogs and bears. And still they fought among themselves, and did not understand the meaning of life. And Tawa again sent the spider grandmother, and she led them up to the third world. And when they arrived at the third world, they were transformed into human beings. And spider grandmother taught them to weave and to plant corn and to make pots, and she bade them to be virtuous. But the third world was cold, and the corn did not grow well, and they could not fire the pots. And then came Hummingbird, bearing the bow drill. a gift from Masawu, the Lord of Fire. And Hummingbird told them that there was an upper world above the sky. So the people began to cook their meat and to make fired pottery. But they became lazy and began to gamble and to turn their faces away from virtue. And finally, Spider Grandmother came again, and she led the people up the inside of a bamboo pole to the fourth world, the upper world beneath the open sky, which is our world, near to the sacred San Francisco peaks where the Kachinas live. Now, the fourth world is our world, and there is much work to be done here. But at the bottom of every kiva, there is the sipapu, the sacred hole which leads down to the third world, and which is the reminder of our journeys with the Spider Grandmother, the Hopis. If you go to Oxford University, near Oxford there is a little pub called the Eagle and Child, better known to its denizens as the Bird and Baby. And there's a small room in the back where Tolkien and a number of his literary and academic friends, C.S. Lewis and so on, used to get together regularly, and they'd read aloud to each other from the stuff that they had been working on. They called themselves the Inklings. And there was one man, I don't know who it wasn't C.S. Lewis, I know that, who, whenever Tolkien would pull out his manuscript, used to put his hand over his face and say, "Oh, God, not more elves." Well, I know how he feels. We are inundated with elves and dwarves and dragons. Now, those of you who are descended from Anglo-Saxon and Germanic and Teutonic stock may object, well, that's my cultural heritage, you know? I mean, why is Tolkien the only guy that gets to have the block on top of that particular pyramid? And, you know, I would say, no, you can be on top of that pyramid as well if you want to. You're free to put out yet another elf, dwarf, dragon game, that's fine. But what the hell are you going to do to differentiate yourself from all the other elf, dwarf, dragon games? I'm not arguing for multiculturalism here for its own sake, okay? I'm not arguing for multiculturalism here because it's right or socially responsible or politically correct. God knows we're not in the business of trying to broaden anyone's mind in this industry. No, I'm arguing for multiculturalism out of pure self-interest. The market is saturated with elves and dwarves. Why not be a little bit different? Look for something else. Look at Magic Carpet, Aladdin, Prince of Persia. All these are hit games, and they're all drawn from a culture that Americans regard with hostility and suspicion. I have here two great science fiction novels. Both of these are winners both of the Hugo and the Nebula Awards. One is Dune. The culture is derived from the Bedouin Arabs. One of them is Lord of Light by Roger Zelazny. The culture is derived from Hindu mythology. Both of these games won both the Hugo and Nebula Awards. Both of them are towering masterpieces of imagination. Both of them are still in print. But would they have won if they had been about elves and dwarves yet again? I think probably not. I think the reason they won is partly due to the fact that they're about something else. And I think we should consider that. Most recently, I've become addicted to a game called Marble Drop, which just came out from Maxis, which is about dropping a marble down through a sort of a series of puzzles, and you have to try and figure out where it's going to go and get it to go in the right place. And it's a great game. I'm having a lot of fun with it. But the background behind everything else are notebooks which look like the pages of Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks. And I find that very charming, and I really appreciate that they went to the trouble to do that. Now, Leonardo da Vinci is yet another dead white male, and I'm sure there are people who would say, no, we should shove them aside entirely. But nevertheless, at least it's not a dwarf. So, how are you going to find this stuff? Okay, I've told you no more elves, for God's sake. Go do something else. How are you going to find it? Well, there's a gimmick. Some of you've got it, some of you don't. I'm very interested to see this now. You've been sitting for a while, so what I'd like you to do is reach in and get your wallets out. Okay, get out your wallets, purses, whatever. We're going to look through here because I'm hoping that a bunch of you have the thing in here that you need. Okay? We are not looking for the money. We know you need the money. Okay? We're not looking for the credit cards. We're not looking for the AAA card. We're not even looking for the CGDA card, which of course you all have. We are looking for, somebody over there got it right, your library card. Who's got them? Hold them up. Come on, let's see. Who's got a library card? That is pathetic! Those few of you can pat yourselves on the back. The rest of you, how in the hell do you think you can possibly work in a creative industry without access to a library? You know what? One of the very first things George Lucas did with his money from Star Wars, he went out and he built a beautiful library and he filled it full of wonderful books because he knew that a creative business was going to require access to a great library. It is not all on the web. The web is wonderful. Don't get me wrong. I looked up some important stuff about 24 hours ago on those terminals outside that I needed for this lecture. But it is far from complete, and it is very badly organized. It's great for reference. It's a terrible teaching tool. You can't really learn anything systematic, and if you really want to learn something new and use that to create a product that's going to last, you're going to have to do some systematic learning. So the second thing you've got to do with that library card is you have got to use it. You do not make brilliant, wonderful, long-lived products by keeping your nose so close to the grindstone all the time that your work is out of focus. You got to take time off to study and to learn and to think. And what that means is you got to take off half a day a week, which in this industry means 6 hours, and tell your boss that during that time the video's not going to get compressed, and the code's not going to get written, and the design and the music and the ad copy and all the rest of it are not going to get made because you are going to go down to the library and you are going to sit in a comfortable chair and you are going to learn something. If you are doing a football game, go read about Knute Rockne and Vince Lombardi and modern pass defenses. If you are doing a flight simulator, go down to the library and read Jane's Defense Weekly and all the world's aircraft. If, God help us, you are doing an Elves and Dwarves game, then go down and read the Icelandic sagas, or at least something other than Tolkien. In the course of this lecture, I have read to you 4 of the world's great creation myths. I would guess, and I may be underestimating you, that most of you had only heard 1 or 2 of them when you came in here. There are, at a rough estimate, 160 living religions in the world. And that does not count the ones that died out, like the ancient Egyptians. A religion is a mythos. It is a psychological and linguistic and philosophical and cultural structure which attracts and holds people's souls. There are 160 sources of myth, of legend, of stories that have touched people deeply. I've told you about just 4. It's all there for the taking. So I set you a creative challenge. When you leave here, go back to your work and look for its mythic foundations. And if you don't find any, then start to dig. Go out to the library and try to find some mythic material to work with. Do some learning. Now, for you hard-headed materialists out there, and I know there are a few, I would point out to you that Oral Roberts and Reverend Moon and Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh have all clearly demonstrated that when you have someone's soul, their money will soon follow. You want to make a product that lasts? Then find a way to touch your player's soul. Stop thinking of him or her as a customer. Start thinking of him or her as a convert. Here endeth the lesson.